Hi guys, so as promised, I am recording the lecture that we started today in class, but I'm going to kind of finish it all the way through. Hopefully you watch it because this is testable material, so it can be on your first test and it can obviously be on the AP exam. I think it's been 2 or 3 years at this point, but the DBQ was on the American Revolutionary War a few years ago, so it is something that's shown up on major parts of the exam. We started with advantages and disadvantages. Because we did this in class, I'm going to run through it very, very quickly for all of the classes we got through this. So first and foremost, keep in mind, Britain does outnumber the colonists 3-1. That does have an enormous impact. Think Russia in the winter in World War II. They're able to just throw men at the situation, and that does have an impact when you have a large army that you can send because you have a large population. On top of that, the British Army is professional. They're paid, they're well regimented, so they're a very disciplined fighting force that will do maneuvers and strategy very well. On top of that, Britain does actually have quite a lot of cash, even though they've been nickel and diming the colonies. So they are able to pay for mercenaries, hired guns, hired soldiers, and they're able to pay for the best of the best, the Hessian mercenaries. On top of that, the British are able to use loyalists, slaves, and Native Americans to essentially disrupt patriot actions inside the colonies. In terms of weaknesses, though, the British public is divided about what should happen to the American colonies. Both sides of the Atlantic have become very, very wealthy through salutary neglect and the mercantilist policies. And the past decade and a half of tension has led to a situation where the colonists are spending so much time protesting that they're not making as much money. And so there are certain segments of the British population that want things to just go back to normal because that's been very profitable for them. Fighting a war in the colonies is very difficult as well. And then on top of that, because Britain thinks they have this in the bag, they don't send their best generals. They keep them at home to defend Britain. So they send poor to mediocre generals. They don't send a lot of supplies, assuming that they will be able to take supplies either forcefully or buy them from loyalists. And they mistreat their soldiers, partially because of that lack of supplies. On top of that, because Britain has that superior standing of the best military in the world, they need to be able to go into a lowly colony and win decisively, or it will be embarrassing to them. Which, as I said, is something that we kind of see throughout history with wars. This is a really big concept in IB, this idea of unequal warfare, and what that means if you are the superior fighting force, quote unquote, as opposed to the weaker fighting force. They have to win, otherwise it just looks like they're losing, whereas the Americans just have to stay alive. Distance and geography in America are also very challenging. It's hard to get all the way across the ocean with an entire battalion of troops and supplies, and then once you get to the country, it is enormous compared to the British Isles. It's just much larger and it's very hilly on the East Coast. So you're dealing with a lot of different kinds of terrain. It's very cold, significantly colder. Actually, even though New York and London sit at about the same latitude, it's significantly colder in New York because of the Gulf Stream and the way that it hits the British Isles. For the colonies' sakes, they have good leaders. All of their leaders are at home. So they get some really good leadership. France and Spain, for their part, would love nothing more than to see a colony kick the ever-living crap out of the British. So they start to send money and help. They don't immediately fully side with the colonists, but they do aid pretty early on. The colonists, like we said, they get to fight defensively. They just have to survive. And that becomes a thorn in the side of the British, which we see at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Agriculturally, they're self-sufficient. So all of their farmers with guns are farmers. So they have food. And then they have that moral advantage. If you are told you're fighting for your freedom and your country and your farm and your wife and your kids, that kind of means more than we paid you to fire the gun accurately. Go fire the gun accurately. However, they are very disorganized. We know that the Albany Plan fails during the 7 Years' War, and by the time we get up to the actual war itself, there hasn't been a huge move towards unity. It's more unified would be the best way to say it. It's more unified. But this isn't a country. This is 13 independent colonies who have a common enemy. And that's kind of the thing that really is going to be a challenge for them, is acting like a central country without a central government, in fact. There's a lot of jealousy between the colonies about who has the better economics or the better land or the better relationships with other countries, whatever it may be. There are jealousies that prevent the colonies from working together very smoothly. This really shouldn't be surprising. You see these jealousies between states today. It was the same thing then. And then on top of that, there is no unified currency. Most of the colonies, because of the Currency Act and because of mercantilism, they had their own currencies. How do you pay Massachusetts soldiers with Virginia currency? They decided to create their own centralized currency, but kind of like with the Weimar Republic in the mid-years between World War I and World War II, they printed too much, and they inflated their currency till it was kind of worthless. The Second Continental Congress is kind of this fundamental building block that we're going to look at, because the Second Continental Congress becomes the de facto government of the United States in its very infancy. It is not technically the first government of the United States. That honor will actually go to the Articles of Confederation, but this is that de facto central government. They agreed to meet as a follow-up to the First Continental Congress, and this time even Georgia sends a delegate. So we have all 13 colonies. They elect John Hancock as president, which we'll come back around to, because he is not granted amnesty, because he is the president of this new de facto government against the British. They are meeting to, quote-unquote, redress their grievances. That basically just means they would like to form a list of all of the stuff that has gone poorly and ask for it to be fixed, essentially. So they're still in that mindset where we can fix this relationship. By the time they actually get a list together of all of their grievances, they have actually decided to declare independence. So the Declaration of Independence at the beginning is the declaration, and then the second part of it is actually that redress of grievances, where they list all the stuff that's wrong. But instead of saying, hey, can we fix this, they go, we want independence because X, Y, Z. There's a lot of lists. This Congress does make one really, really good decision, and that one really, really good decision is to pick Washington as their general, and they pick him because he is an amazingly wealthy Virginian. That's why they pick him. He is very well connected from a very large state, and he's very wealthy. So not only can he pull in a lot of men from his state because he has good standing there, he can kick in a lot of funding. He's well connected to other wealthy people who can kick in funding. So this is kind of the equivalent of like GoFundMe with Washington as your picture. It's great. But when we're looking at this, the reality is he's not actually picked because he's an amazing general. He's picked because of the other political attributes that he brings. He happens to be a brilliant general, though. He has that wonderful quality of amazing in strategy and I would die for you, which is convenient when you're a general. But the whole entire early phase of this war is very contradictory. There are actions that very much denote we would like peace and we would like to fix this relationship. And at the same time, there are actions that are happening that are like, we would like to kill you all with our muskets. And so to reconcile both of those, what we need to remember is that this war starts out of very high tension, not out of a declaration for independence. The fighting happens before that. And so the early phase of the war is kind of like when a relationship is breaking down and you're like, it's over, guys, it's over. And everybody knows except the two of them because they're still trying to hold on. But it's over. So they're trying to reconcile, but it's not going to happen. They're still fighting. Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill are both battles are both battles that are technically British victories, but not really. So the same thing kind of happens with Lexington and Concord. It happens at Bunker Hill. While the British obtain their objective, the casualty rate is very, very high. So, for example, with Bunker Hill, let's move forward. It's easier to explain with this. You have a hill. It's actually Breeders' Hill, not Bunker Hill, but the battle is misnamed. You have a hill kind of outside of Boston across the harbor. And what the colonists do is they put some cannons on top of it and they lightly arm the hill because they don't have a lot of ammunition, and they just start firing on the British troops in Boston who were sent there to enforce the intolerable acts or the coercive acts. And they're this annoying fly on a hill with a cannon. And the British are kind of in this position where the Americans don't really pose a threat. They don't have enough people or enough ammunition to really take Boston, but they're firing on the soldiers. So they need to be taken out as, again, that display of almighty force, as opposed to we can tie. They can't tie. So what ends up happening is that the generals who are in Boston decide to take Breeders' Hill back from the Americans. And as they're going up the hill, because the Americans are so low on ammunition, the Americans wait until very late in the charge to start firing upon the British, which means that their firing is very accurate. Muskets are much more accurate the closer you get. So by waiting until the British are very, very close to the top of the hill, they're very deadly. And the Americans essentially stay on the hill until they run out of ammunition, and then they retreat. So technically, yes, the British do win the battle, but the Americans win in terms of casualties. So we have 441 Americans versus over 1,000 British to take one hill because the cannons are annoying. So you can kind of see in this one at the top, all the red coats at the top of the hill. That's the example that they're waiting until they get very high on the hill. Like, they could probably hit them with their wide open lines, but they're waiting until they get closer so that their aim is more deadly. Again, like I said, despite the fact that fighting is happening and you're literally shooting guns at each other, Congress is going to seek reconciliation in the form of the Olive Branch Petition. So they're trying to reconcile. They're kind of putting out this, like, we would really, really like to go back to the way things were. Please, this was profitable for both of us. Would you please just let us go back to the way things were? And the king rejects it and declares the colonies to be in open rebellion. On top of that, this is when you pull in the Hessian mercenaries. So they're hiring thousands of German mercenaries, which makes this, quote-unquote, no longer a family affair. So instead of it just being between Britain and America, we are now hiring mercenaries to come in. And the message is very clear. You are in rebellion, and we will crush you. And we will do everything we can to crush you. We are not negotiating. Which causes Thomas Jefferson to write The Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. So it's this push because the American public is also not unified. There's a lot of benefits to being part of the British Empire that would be lost if you left. But to sway people that this is a good idea, that we really should see this through and we should finish this fight and we shouldn't just accept that Britain won't negotiate with us, Thomas Jefferson essentially writes that he is resolved to die as a free man rather than live as a slave. I know that he uses the term slave and he doesn't mean it the way that we mean actual slavery. He's talking about slaves to a government. So just kind of keep that in mind. Like, he actually puts that language into the Declaration of Independence and they changed it. They took the references out. But it is in the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. He's not talking about literal African American slavery. He's talking about bondage to a government. On top of that, the thing that really drives things home, because Thomas Jefferson is great and all, and we look back at him and think, yes, he is a mover and a shaker in politics. He's very elite. Like, very elite. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, because it's very short, it's not really a book, but it's a pamphlet, Common Sense, is written in more common vernacular. It's written in a language that most people at the time would have understood, that this is what we should be doing. Like, we really should be fighting this nation. They don't have a right to control us. And he calls it common sense because it's kind of one of those, well, duh, like, why should they control us? Like, why would you have this belief? This is common sense that we should fight against them. And because it's written in very colloquial, common vernacular, it sways a lot of people. Like, this is the turning point in American public opinion that fighting for independence is worth it. So he publishes Common Sense, presenting a clear argument for independence. We have 120,000 copies sold very, very quickly. And as you'll see in your AMSCO book, his argument is essentially, why should a tiny island control a huge continent? Especially one so far away, and he calls for democratic republic in America. In fact, he puts forth a notion very similar to popular sovereignty, that people should be able to rule America, not a king. And that piece, it's essentially a piece of propaganda, leads to that open revolt, and it really starts to shift public opinion. And it's at that point that you eventually get states calling for independence. So New Hampshire and North Carolina create their own independent governments and their own independent constitutions that do not include any royal government in them at all. At this point, things start to turn pretty bad for America. So remember, Britain is really putting the burn on right now. They want this over. They need to squash the American uprising. They have declared them to be in rebellion. They're pulling in mercenaries. They're landing troops in New York City harbor. They're bringing in this invading force. And it's at this point that America is really looking to France saying, could you help us out, please? Like, we've been loyal supporters of you illegally through the Navigation Acts. Like, we've gone around them to support you. And we know you got kicked out of this country, but we would really like to see Britain also kicked out. Wouldn't you like to see Britain get kicked out too? You got kicked out. Let's kick them out. Help us. France isn't willing to openly side with a colony that's likely to lose, but they would love to see Britain get smushed a little bit. So what they do is they start to give arms and ammunition to the Americans. They're not really sending men yet, but they are sending a lot of gunpowder. They're sending a lot of materials that can be used, because obviously we're not going to get that from Britain anymore. So all of those finished goods, like guns, that we would have been getting from Britain, they're not going to sell them to us anymore. So France starts to do it. It's lucrative for the French, and it helps the American forces out while also kind of hurting the British. It's like a win-win-win all the way around, except for the British. As that peak really hits, and it becomes really obvious that Britain is not negotiating and we really don't have a choice, the public opinion has been swayed between the causes and necessities of taking up arms and common sense, we get a Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, who proposes that redress of grievances should be a declaration of independence from Congress to the world. So it is a committee that appoints Jefferson along with a couple other men to write this statement. And like I said, it's two parts. So the first part is the declaration, and the second part is the redress of grievances. The thing with countries is, you can't be a country unless other countries think that you're a country. It's like popularity. You're not popular unless other popular people think that you're popular. You have to be recognized by other countries as a country. You can't just go to an island and be like, this is mine, it is a country. It doesn't work like that. That's not how the world works. So what he does is he addresses the Declaration of Independence to the world. So if you're asked who is the audience of the Declaration of Independence, it's to the American people, it's to the British people and their government, and it's to world governments so that they will recognize our cause as a country. And that's really important because it's essentially directed to the world. We are declaring independence. This is why. These are our lists of things that have happened and why they're not okay. And that vote that supports this is really important. So this is where you get the formal Declaration of Independence, when most of the colonists would probably argue, yeah, this is the turning point. Most of us did not. Most of us argue that it came well before this, but formally, this has now become a war for independence, not just rebellion. It's at this point that King George's statue gets torn down in New York City after the Declaration of Independence is signed. Tearing down statues is very symbolic. It happens throughout history. You should be familiar. When we actually get into the Declaration of Independence, so again, keep in mind we have a certain audience. You have access to these slides. I'm not going to go through everything, but you do have the 56 signers. They are considered traitors to England, and a bounty is placed on all of their heads. They know that by signing this document, they win or they die. That's basically how this works. They would have to escape very far away into refuge to kind of escape the British, but they will never be welcome in Britain, essentially. John Adams estimates that a third of the American population are patriots, a third are loyalists, and a third are neutral. Your book argues that those population numbers are slightly different. So it argues that about 40% are patriots, only 20% loyalists, and then a slightly smaller neutral group as well. So when we're looking at that, John Adams is close, but he might deflate those numbers to make people think, oh, this is a bigger problem than it really is, that we should be a patriot too. A lot of the loyalists, who are also called Tories, fought for a return to colonial rule. There are, again, a lot of benefits to the trade agreements between England and America, so losing that's going to be detrimental. It is. They're loyal to the king, maybe not to Parliament, but to the king. And some of them flee to go to England, where some of them have never lived, sometimes for generations. And a lot of their estates were sold to fund the war. Our strongholds as they stand, you'll kind of notice in a lot of the major port cities, so Newport, New York, Philadelphia, which is on a river up the Chesapeake Bay, or not the Chesapeake Bay, but the Maryland Bay. We have Norfolk, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, all of those major areas where you have ports. Those are British strongholds, with the exception of Boston, who take back their city relatively early. This is because it's easy to land troops here. So they land troops in the cities and they kind of bunker down, and then they expand from there. So most of the countryside is going to be Patriot strongholds as well. And then you have that contested territory. New Jersey is probably the most important of them because that's where the bulk of the army is fighting, between Philadelphia and New York. We're going to see a lot of fighting in that area. Despite the fact that we have a lot of defeats, eventually, about 2 years into the war, Washington starts to gain some major victories. So one of them is that on Christmas night, because it's a surprise attack, Washington recrosses the Delaware after having retreated out of New York. He recrosses the Delaware River and he attacks a encampment of Hessians at Trenton. He attacks them the day after Christmas in the morning. Nobody expects this because A, it's Christmas, and B, it's quite ballsy to attack Hessian mercenaries when you have a defeated army in the middle of winter. And they're successful in that surprise attack. They go on, about a month later, to defeat the British at Princeton, again in New Jersey, that contested territory. So we are starting to see some fighting where the Americans are winning, and he knows he has to do this because the winters are very hard and he loses a lot of men. But if he can prove that he can win with those fewer men in very tough conditions, then why can't they win in summer too? It kind of gives you hope. So we have that very famous image of Washington crossing the Delaware. And then we have the Turning Point Battle. Every war has at least one, sometimes multiple. The Turning Point Battle is that one that really switches the tide. And the reason that is Saratoga is because it is fought in a very traditionally European way. So we have American soldiers who have been trained by French operatives who are meeting the British on a field of battle in conventional military battle. So in the lines, fighting like Europeans, and they win. Not only do they have less troops, but they have a smarter strategy. So they rout the British, and they're able to come in behind them and get them to surrender. And they're able to get them to surrender a huge chunk of their army. And by doing this in a very traditionally European style of warfare, it proves to other European countries, aka France and Spain, that the Americans mean business. They can do this. They're not just farmers with guns. They can train a military. And what it does is it openly causes France to side with the Americans and declare them independent as well. So we have one country that's saying, yeah, you're an independent country and we'll come help you. And they start to send troops, not just guns and ammunition and money, but troops, which the Americans desperately need. It's also really important because once you have troops surrender, they're essentially out of the war. So now we have one less military that's kind of hanging around in New York. In the month after Saratoga or so, Congress officially adopts the Articles of Confederation. It doesn't get ratified until much later after the war is over, but we do finally have an official plan for a government of the United States of America. I realize this is going to be weird because there's a person that we call AOC now, but it's often just shorthanded to AOC. In his second winter at Valley Forge, because his first winter was the one with Trenton and Princeton, Washington is training soldiers very, very heavily. So we have Baron von Steuben, who's Prussian, who comes in to really help whip the troops into shape. He is world famous at this point. He is a superb military advisor. The Prussians are famed for their military. This is like basically around modern day Germany. So him coming in and helping whip the troops into shape really turns them into a world-class fighting force. That being said, it's still a very hard winter, and they still lose a lot of people. It's just very harsh. The Franco-American alliance gets solidified during this time period, so we had them recognize the United States after the Battle of Saratoga. That takes a little bit of time to formalize, so we get the formal Declaration of American Independence from France. We have two treaties, one for friendship, so a military alliance, and then a trade alliance. So no more mercantilism. We officially get to trade with the French. And then the French also give men and money, and most importantly of all, a navy. Because the problem that Americans have been having so far is they could push the British back to the coast. You'll notice that the strongholds are all on the coast. But then once you push the British to the coast, they just get on their ships and they sail away, and then they're safe. They need a navy to block them in so that they can't get away. Spoiler alert, that's gonna happen. This is when the tide really begins to turn. The British are like, maybe our generals are not doing that well. Maybe we should have sent better ones. And so they start to replace them with better ones. But the better one is a little afraid of Washington, and he starts retreating. So we have Washington in pursuit of the main general of the British Army, Clinton. And we start to get a world war that develops. France and England and then Spain and England know that England is kind of tapped. Like, yes, they have money, but they're stretched a little thin. They've already fought a lot of world wars, and yes, they came out on top, but everybody's just a little stretched. And France and Spain both know that if they can make the British fight on two fronts, so defend their homeland and fight in America, they probably won't be able to do it. Mostly because they won't have the support of the British people. They have to defend their homeland more than they have to defend an American colony. So it would cause them to retreat from the Americas, therefore losing to a colony, which would be awfully embarrassing. It's at this point that you have Cornwallis entering Yorktown, and you have Washington essentially in hot pursuit. So he's able to kind of corner him in Yorktown, but what has always happened before is when they cornered them at the sea, the British just sailed away. And that's exactly what the British expected to do this time, except the French come in with their navy, kick the ever-living crap out of the British navy, and they surround them. So Washington's troops by land, the French navy by sea, and they get General Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown, effectively ending the war. So this is kind of that battle. So in this you have Cornwallis, and then you have Washington, and they kind of all meet here, and they get stuck in this spot. The British are supposed to come in and rescue them, but the French come in and kick their butts. Which is convenient for the Americans. The World Turned Upside Down is actually a song from the time period, so it is a refrain that gets sung as people realize that a small colony has just beat the best military in the world at that point. And that prompts the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty, which is signed by John Adams, John Jay, and Ben Franklin. They go to sign in Paris because most of the peace treaties are signed in Paris at that point. It is kind of important that you know the years for these. So if you see the 1780s, that's the American Revolutionary. The 1760s is the 7 Years' War. There's going to be another one later. But it does formally recognize the country as the United States of America. It gives all of the British territory south of the Great Lakes and west of the Mississippi to the Americas. So they're able to take all of that land. It does not affect Canada. Alright. That is the war. Hopefully this was helpful. I know the video is kind of long, but you can watch it in chunks and pieces. And I will see you guys on Friday to talk about the Constitution.